reading for today comes from 2 Kings 2, chapters 1 through 12. Today's reading centers on the transfer of power and authority from prophet Elijah to Elisha. Their travels, which retrace the path of Joshua back to Moab, the place where Moses died, and the parting of the waters, demonstrate that Elisha and Elijah are legitimate successors of the great prophet Moses. Now, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven by a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of prophets who were in Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. The company of prophets who were at Jericho drew near Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master away from you?" And he answered, "Yes, I know. Be silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the company of prophets also went and stood at some distance from them, as they both were standing at the Jordan. Then Elijah took his mantle and rolled it up and struck the water, and the water was parted to one side and to the other until the two of them crossed on dry ground. Then they crossed. Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I may do for you before I'm taken from you." Elisha said, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit." He responded, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet, if you see me as I am being taken from you, it will be granted you. If not, it will not." As they continue walking and talking, a chariot of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them, and Elijah ascended into a whirlwind heaven. Elisha kept watching and crying out, "Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." But when he could no longer see him, he grasped his own clothes and tore them into pieces. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God.
Our gospel today comes from the 9th chapter of Mark. Excuse me. Now, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, and he led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." And suddenly they were looked around and saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. I remember climbing some high, steep, I guess they were mountains. They're, certainly nothing of an epic proportion, but certainly large and high and steep. And I remembered that, as we would climb and climb and climb, as the oxygen would grow a little bit thinner, uh, each step would seem to weaken my legs just a little bit more and take all that it could. I remember the breath that, was suddenly breathing hard and then became all that much harder, and just how uncomfortable that feeling of being out of breath was. I remember, coming upon and following a path that would somehow come to a dead end or an obstacle, and then we would have to find another route around it. And I remember wondering, is this really worth it to climb this hill? Everything looks so mundane. Rocks and obstacles and dirt and paths that just seemed like they were just filled with things. I can't even imagine what it was like to go without modern footwear, in either bare feet or in sandals, where needles would get stuck and the pebbles would cause, pain in one's foot. But then you hit the summit. You hit that place where the apex comes and where the vista is broad and clear, and you breathe in the steepness and you say, my goodness, and are filled with this wonder and this awe and this beauty. Somehow, all of those little steps, all of those rocks that got in the way, all of those little obstacles somehow become minimized with the awe and the beauty of what can be seen from this summit. I also remember, as you're up there with that great view and everything, and as you view sometimes not only the broad expanse of the environment, but also as you might look down and see, sometimes those periods come where you wonder, will my feet stay? Will I slip? What would happen should I roll? And somehow that kind of rush of worry and fear come upon. As I think about those experiences of climbing a mountain, I thought somehow about the disciples climbing a steep hill, a high hill. For what? I wonder what they might have thought as Jesus took, as one commentator wrote, Pete and Jimmy and John up the mountain, as they experienced that climbing and wondering, what is this all about? Why did Jesus call us and summon us? And what is the purpose for us climbing this mountain? I imagine what they saw once they reached the top. When suddenly Jesus is transfigured into this brightness, into this whiteness that somehow transforms everything around. And as they see this bright spectacle up there, as they are filled with this wonder of what has happened to him, they see also two other historic figures, Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, everything that has preceded them. For them, they knew that this was a meaningful thing. These were the two prophets who left this earth without dying. And they knew they were in a holy spot. They knew that something marvelous was there. And out of a kind of dumbfoundedness and fear, Peter says, it's good for us to be here. This is a wonder. This is a marvel. But wonders what he should do and offers to make 3 huts. then a voice comes from the clouds. One can only imagine a booming voice, a voice that speaks out to them, a voice from heaven. This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him. And as suddenly as that feeling of awe and wonder come upon them, it's all gone. Moses and Elijah are gone. Jesus is likened as they had seen him climbing that hill. And Jesus says, it's time to go down. It's not time to stick around up here. It's time to go hit those ordinary rocks and see them from the other side. You have to use all those muscles in your legs to climb each step in the reverse direction. And that's the story of the Transfiguration. There's a lot of things I'd like to say. I mean, one of the things I remember about this story is hearing it over and over again in church as a kid and wondering, first of all, what is a transfiguration? That didn't make any sense. That was just sounded like some big churchy word that didn't mean anything to me. I mean, I didn't live in a day of computer graphics when you could see faces just kind of magically just, reform over the air. It just kind of sounded like a church word that I didn't understand. And what was the purpose of this? Was this God just showing off? I mean, the other miracles that I had seen where Jesus heals somebody, where Jesus has compassion on somebody, there seems to be something of a nature of help, of love, of someone's neighbor. This one just kind of seemed like God showing off. And for what purpose? Until, well, after years of preaching this and studying this and understanding this in the context of where it is in the scriptures, you start to understand it as something different. For a while, we've been reading all of our readings from the first chapter of Mark during the season. Other than the week that we had the reading from John, everything has been from just chapter 1 in Mark. And now we transfer and go to Mark 9, and we've missed everything in between, and especially what happened just before this. In chapter 8, in the very center of the chapter, in the very center of the book of Mark, where Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And this is where Peter declares, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." This is that moment. But then right afterwards, Jesus talks about his death, about going to Jerusalem, about what will happen to him there, about how he will be betrayed, how he will be scorned, how he will die. And the disciples do not want to hear that. And as they're starting to think that maybe they backed the wrong horse, maybe as they're starting to think that this guy who does these miracles maybe isn't so powerful because he's going to head to Jerusalem to die, that's the context that Jesus takes them up the mountain. That's the context where Jesus takes them and lifts them on a hill and fills them with an image of God, of power and glory. From a perspective of a liturgical year, we end the season of Epiphany on a mount and then go into the valley of Lent. And the next time we move out of Lent, we are again upon a hill, but this hill is one of Calvary, the hill of the cross. And so it reminds us that this transfiguration has some kind of power. I thought a lot about, as I prepared today, about this words that have this prefix trans, which means to change, which means to completely reform something. And what the difference between a transfigured being is and a transformed being is, because we hear that often in terms of what we are supposed to be, what church and faith do to us as they transform us, as they transform the way we think, as they transform the way we do things, as they transform the objects of our care and love from self to God and to others. And what is this difference between transfiguration and transforming? Jesus is transfigured. It means in some ways that the disciples who saw Jesus as an ordinary human being, maybe with miraculous powers, but somebody they could identify with, somebody who had skin and flesh, they now saw in a wonder and amazement that somehow shaved those human elements off and reminded them that somehow there was something divine about him, that there was something bright and holy and magnificent, something that brought him and made him heavenly. And as Jesus was transfigured, it's as if he no longer wore the clothes of this human world, and he wore heavenly clothes. He wore this heavenly arraignment of brightness and wonder. What I struggled with this week is, what does that say about us, though? What does it say about what God's purpose with us is? Is God's purpose to transfigure us or transform us? Because transformation means that we somehow change the very essence of who we are. That we change somehow the sense and almost the DNA of who we are. Is God's purpose for us to be transfigured or transformed? As we enter into the season of Lent, it's a common practice for people to begin to do something in some ways of maybe giving up something that they've come to become habitual in their lives, or to take on a new task, or to take on something else. In some ways, you could think about it as part of the process of rubbing down and kind of getting under and rubbing around to rub off some of the silt and the grime and the things that have kind of caused us to hide who we are and who God's made us to be. Over the course of years and over the course of growing, over the course of being human, we sometimes learn how to put on a facade. One of the things I'm reminded of is that wonderful word that I was taught when I was learning about Genesis 2. And at the very end of the chapter, there's this comment. It seems superfluous, as a reader. It says that the man and the woman were naked and they were not ashamed. You notice in chapter 3 what happens as soon as they make that fall, as soon as they take that chance, as soon as they somehow are separated from God and eat that fruit, they recognize their nakedness and they become ashamed. They hide themselves with clothes and they hide from God. And it reminds us that that's part of our human nature, is that as we grow, we continue to hide ourselves, sometimes out of shame, sometimes out of just a sense of hiding who we are so people don't see the fullness of us, hiding our embarrassment, hiding our responsibility, hiding our culpability. Sometimes out of the hurts and the pains that we've suffered in life, we put on coats of armor to protect us. We call it defensiveness. And oftentimes comments that somehow might regularly come close to us and help us remind us of our humanness, we fend off with offensive comments back to fend them away as part of that armor. Or we wall people off so that they can't touch us and come into us. It seems to me that part of the process of Lent is polishing that stuff away. It's of getting the gritty sandpaper and rubbing it down and getting through that armor to our humanity once again. To get down to that nakedness that we can bear before God. And God can see us even in our embarrassment. And God can tell us that we are still beloved children of God. Even in our nakedness, even in our embarrassment, even with our sin, even with the falsehoods that we have created. And as a person who's been forgiven by God of such embarrassment, it makes us far less judgmental of those who stand next to us, who are also naked and standing at the feet of Jesus. And somehow I remember, again, a different creation story about Genesis 1, that we are created in the image, in the likeness of God, that somehow God has created us to speak the very language of God, which is love, which is not always being protected, but it means, as Jesus shows us, to be vulnerable. Sometimes I think we've worn this armor too long. Sometimes I think we've worn these clothes too long. Sometimes we've worn this sheet of stone too long that it maybe has transformed us from people who bear the image of God to people who have become more, in our own essence, concerned about ourselves, to be concerned about our well-being, our comfort, our joy. And that's where I believe maybe we are transformed. If sin has changed us and made us into different kinds of people, maybe that's what God is calling us to be, is calling us out. And that the Spirit actually changes that human nature of us into something that gives us a connection with the divine. But no matter what, there is some trans changing that happens within us. And that's what we're called to do. And this mountaintop experience of a transfiguration, this place where we now look at the earth and somehow, because we have seen that vista, can now look over things and see each of those rocks that had been an obstacle, that had been just something that had made life tough, now becomes part of the miracle. To recognize that that mountain grew by feet and sometimes inches at a time over a course and expanse of time that's beyond our imagination. That we too are changing that course and that mind, not because of us, but because we allow God to break through our shields, to break through our armor, to break through the stone shields and walls that we built around us, and to allow God to somehow touch our hearts and change who we are and how we are. The disciples in chapter 8, in Mark chapter 8, didn't want to hear that Jesus could be vulnerable. They didn't want to hear that Jesus could die. They didn't want to hear that because for them, that seemed like weakness. That seemed not to be the image of the divine. And maybe even at Calvary, they still failed to see it. But we are an Easter people, and we understand that the crucified Christ is also the risen Christ. That the crucified Christ, who allows the world to come and touch him, even to do harm, cannot ultimately harm him. And that when we allow God to touch our souls, God ultimately isn't here to destroy who we are, but to transfigure us into who we were created to be. God is always changing us. God is always moving us. God is always opening us to both be vulnerable and to see God in a different light, and to see ourselves as beloved children when we listen to him. This is who God's called us to be. This is who God calls us and invites us to join in that Lenten journey, to allow ourselves to peel off the layers and to encounter God, and to not be afraid, but to be changed. Amen.